Welcome to Old World Order Theology with Brian Newberry. This is the tinfoil hat edition, as you can see. Why is it the tinfoil hat edition? Because we're going to be talking about the Freemasons, and did the Freemasons, in fact, pledge to conquer or infiltrate the Catholic Church? A lot of times, before we get started, if you could please like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, click the bell so you get notifications, and share with your friends. Yes, you can share the nutty tinfoil hat host. So, the Freemasons' infiltration into the Catholic Church. A lot of times if you bring these kind of things up, somebody will just automatically dismiss it, which is not biblical. Proverbs 18:13 says, "He who judges a matter before he knows it is folly and shame unto him." You have to know both sides. But people don't like to believe these things because they are a bit sensational, and sometimes for some people they're a bit scary. So rather than deal with it, they, like an ostrich, will put their head in the sand and let the onslaught happen while they're not looking. They'll click their heels and say, close their eyes, say, "No place like home, no place like home, no place like home." And then they'll just say, "Oh, well, that's conspiracy." See, the problem with that mentality is that conspiracy is a real word for a real reason, because most crimes that are committed were conspired to be committed before they were committed. They're not just crimes of impulse, especially coordinated efforts such as what I'm about to share today. So, no, I am not a conspiracy theorist. For the most part, I am a conspiracy factualist, because there is a plethora of sources and evidence that conspiracies such as this one actually do exist. They have their own documents. So what is Freemasonry? You might not really know what it is. Freemasonry is a fraternity of brothers. It was founded officially in the year 1717 in England. They gather in a place called a lodge. They are not a specific religion. They do require that you believe in God. Doesn't matter which God, doesn't matter which religion. And really they are kind of it is a cult. They might pretend to be a fraternity, kind of like a labor union, a place they hang out with the fellas and do things, but they do have initiation rites. They do have secrets that you have to swear a blood oath on you and your children after you, that if you were to reveal the secrets, you can die, you can get killed, and also a curse on your posterity. And if you ask anybody, any Catholic exorcist, they'll tell you that it's utterly demonic and satanic, because the higher up you get in the ranks, the more is revealed to you, and it becomes a cult of the occult, the rituals and so forth. Now, maybe not all lodges, a lodge is a place where they gather at, not all lodges do these kind of things. Some of them are rather docile, and it is more like a fraternity for some, I suppose, because I've heard that testimony, even by higher ranking members. That's assuming they're telling the truth. But in other lodges, these things are absolutely true. And I've read several of their own documents, so it's not like I'm just taking someone else's word for it. So what it appears to be is that because you don't have to believe in any particular one religion or one God, it is a collection of all the religions. So basically, a lot of the things that we've been discussing, if you've been following me on this channel, especially with Pope Pius IX, because what I'm about to share happens in the same time frame, in the 1800s, that the things like indifferentism, meaning not caring really the particulars of religion, just let's all just compromise and find what we all have in common, so that we're not arguing with each other, not disagreeing with one another. So basically what the Freemasons, their end goal is to create a one world religion. Basically, we don't care about dogmas and doctrines. Let's just stick with God and and he loves us, and let's just be kind to one another. That's kind of it in a nutshell. It's collectivism and so forth. One world religion, kind of a Unitarian, universal, like everyone goes to heaven kind of thing. And it's not surprising when you do some research that in the communist revolution of 1917, Lenin and Stalin were both Freemasons. And the Freemasons were also largely responsible for the French Revolution in 1789, where priests and nuns were beheaded in the streets, and so were the aristocrats and the monarchs. So what will I be sharing today? Today I'm going to be reading out of a book written by the late John Vennari, who is editor of Catholic Family News, The Permanent Instruction of the Alta Vendita, a Masonic blueprint for the subversion of the Catholic Church. Now, he doesn't quote this document, the Alta Vendita, in full here. It's actually out of print, but if you get the book Infiltration by Taylor Marshall, he has the book in its entirety in the appendix. So this is an instruction manual for the Catholic to kind of know the signs of Freemasonry in the Church, to know their plans and know how to combat it. So I'm going to be reading from it. Might not be able to finish the whole thing. It's a little booklet, thin one. Might not be able to finish the whole thing in this episode, so then we'll do a part 2. But I will be reading from it to give you an idea of what's going on in the Church. Because if you're like me, when I became Catholic, I started to notice a few things here and there that just seemed out of place and seemed theologically wrong. So I did a lot of research on it. I spoke with other Catholics of the traditional type, and I kind of I fell into this, and having some knowledge already of what the Freemasons were, everything started clicking and making sense. The dots started connecting, the light bulbs started turning on. So yes, I am a full believer in the Freemasonic infiltration, not only of the Catholic Church, but of the universities and of political organizations and positions all around the world. It is a global effort. So let's get into the Permanent Instruction of the Alta Vendita by the late John Vennari. Few Catholics know of the Permanent Instruction of the Alta Vendita, a secret document written in the early 19th century that mapped out a blueprint for the subversion of the Catholic Church. The Alta Vendita was the highest lodge of the Carbonari, an Italian secret society with links to Freemasonry, which, along with Freemasonry, was condemned by the Catholic Church. Father E. Cahill, Society of Jesus, in his book Freemasonry and the Anti-Christian Movement, states that the Alta Vendita was commonly supposed to have been, at the time, the governing center of European Freemasonry. The Carbonari were most active in Italy and France. In his book Athanasius and the Church of Our Time, Bishop Rudolf Graber quoted a Freemason who declared that the goal of Freemasonry is no longer the destruction of the Church, but to make use of it by infiltrating it. In other words, since Freemasonry cannot completely obliterate Christ's Church, it plans not only to eradicate the influence of Catholicism in society, but also to use the Church's structure as an instrument of renewal, progress, and enlightenment to further many of its own principles and goals, close quote. So let's just talk about a couple of those things there. You might notice if you're watching this at the time of the recording, there are no sacraments available for most Catholics around the world. So society has seemed to, at the moment, kind of have the upper hand, and the Church has bent the knee to the state and is no longer giving out the revealed ordinary means of salvific grace. So let that sink in. And then it talks about renewal, progress, and enlightenment. So as we said before on this channel, the Enlightenment period and the Enlightenment philosophers were inherently anti-Catholic. And as Pius IX stated in an encyclical that I read not too long ago on this channel, progress is always the notion of those, or the idea of those who want to destroy the church. So that's based on a framework of evolutionary philosophy, that things have to get better, or they naturally get better, and they naturally change. And that's the political philosophy of those who are enemies of the church, because Christ gave his deposit of faith to the apostles once and for all, and since God is eternal and immutable, the teachings of the church are also eternal and immutable. That's a big point to make. So let us continue. Quote, "The strategy advanced in the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita is astonishing in its audacity and cunning. From the start, the document tells of a process that will take decades to accomplish. Those who drew up the document knew that they would not see its fulfillment. They were inaugurating a work that would be carried on by succeeding generations of the initiated. The permanent instruction says, in our ranks, the soldier dies and the struggle goes on." Close quote. So this is a long, gradual process, right? So it's, some of these ideas would be too radical to implement immediately. So what you do is you make little changes and compromises along the way, kind of the proverbial frog simmering in the pot, right? You can't just throw a frog in a boiling pot of water. It'll jump out immediately because it'll know that's not right. But if you put it in lukewarm water and just put it on simmer, he'll cook to death because he won't notice the change. So that's kind of the strategy of the Freemasons in the Catholic Church. They make little changes and then they take advantage of political crises to give an excuse to make the changes and so forth. Let us continue. Quote, "The instruction called for the dissemination of liberal ideas and axioms throughout society and within institutions of the Catholic Church, so that laity, seminarians, clerics, and prelates would, over the years, gradually be imbued with progressive principles. In time, this mindset would be so pervasive that priests would be ordained, bishops would be consecrated, and cardinals would be nominated, whose thinking was in step with the modern thought rooted in the French Revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man and other principles of 1789, such as the equality of religions, separation of church and state, religious pluralism, etc. Eventually, a pope would be elected from these ranks, who would lead the church on the path of enlightenment and renewal." A pope, right? They stated that it was not their aim to place a Freemason on the chair of Peter. Their goal was to effect an environment that would eventually produce a pope and a hierarchy won over to the ideas of liberal Catholicism, all the while believing themselves to be faithful Catholics. These Catholic leaders, then, would no longer oppose the modern ideas of the Revolution, as had been consistent practice of the popes from 1789 until 1958. The death of Pope Pius XII, who condemned these liberal principles, but would amalgamate them into the church. The end result would be a Catholic clergy and laity marching under the banner of enlightenment, all the while thinking that they are marching under the banner of the apostolic keys. Is it possible? For those who may believe this scheme to be too far-fetched, a goal too hopeless for the enemy to attain, it should be noted that both Pope Pius IX and Pope Leo XIII asked that the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita to be published, no doubt in order to prevent such a tragedy from taking place. However, if such a dark state of affairs would ever come to pass, there would obviously be three unmistakable means of recognizing it. 1. It would produce an upheaval of such magnitude that the entire world would realize that there had been a major revolution inside the Catholic Church in line with modern ideas. It would be clear to all that an updating had been taking place. 2. A new theology would be introduced that would be in contradiction to previous teachings. 3. The Freemasons themselves would voice their cockadoodle of triumph, believing that the Catholic Church had finally seen the light on such points as equality of religions, the secular state, pluralism, and whatever other compromises had been achieved. Let's just stop there for a minute. I think if anybody who's been paying attention, in recent years, they could see that all of these things have taken place. There is a new theology, literally, since 1965, the Vatican II Council, a new practice of religion, a new take on things to update, for the church to update itself to the modern, so-called modern world, as if modern man were different than ancient man. Ridiculous. And the Catholic Church has steadily become more like the secular world, and like I said, bent the knee to the secular state. So it appears that all of these things have been fulfilled. Let's continue. The authenticity of the Alta Vendita documents. Quote, the secret papers of the Alta Vendita that fell into the hands of Pope Gregory XVI embrace a period that goes from 1820 to 1846. They were published at the request of Pope Pius IX by Crettenau Joly in his work The Roman Church and Revolution. With the brief of approbation of February 25, 1861, which he addressed to the author, Pope Pius IX guaranteed the authenticity of these documents, but he did not allow anyone to divulge the true members of the Alta Vendita implicated in this correspondence. Close quote. So, the Catholic Pope, the blessed Pope Pius IX, he guaranteed the authenticity of these documents. This isn't something that is fabricated. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is conspiracy fact. It's Exhibit A. It's evidence admissible in the court of reason. So we must take these things seriously. This isn't a bunch of renegade Catholics trying to revolt against the current pontificate or Vatican II. These are people who are aware of real ideas and real enemies. Let us continue. Quote, the full text of the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita is also contained in Monsignor George E. Dillon's book, Grand Orient Freemasonry Unmasked. When Pope Leo XIII was presented with a copy of Monsignor Dillon's book, he was so impressed that he ordered an Italian version to be completed and published at his own expense. In the encyclical Humanum Genus, 1884, Leo XIII called upon Catholic leaders to tear off the mask from Freemasonry and make plain to all what it really is. The publication of these documents is a means of tearing off the mask. And if the popes asked that these letters be published, it is because they wanted all Catholics to know the secret society's plans to subvert the church from within, so that Catholics would be on their guard and hopefully prevent such a catastrophe from taking place. Close quote. So, in the history of the church, I believe that no fewer than 12 popes and in no fewer than 22 encyclicals have condemned Freemasonry explicitly, and it is a Catholic who is a Freemason, and if they refuse to get out of Freemasonry, they are subject to excommunication. So, like I said, not conspiracy theory, conspiracy fact. Continue. The permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita. Quote, what follows is not the entire instruction, but the sections that are most pertinent to our discussion. The document reads, with emphasis added. So now we're going to quote from the actual document. Quote, our ultimate end is that of Voltaire and of the French Revolution, the final destruction of Catholicism and even of the Christian idea. The Pope, whoever he is, will never come to the secret societies. It is up to the secret societies to take the first step toward the Church, with the aim of conquering both of them. The task that we are going to undertake is not the work of a day, or of a month, or of a year. It may last several years, perhaps a century, but in our ranks the soldier dies and the struggle goes on. We do not intend to win the popes to our cause, to make them neophytes of our principles, propagators of our ideas. That would be a ridiculous dream. And if events turn out in some way, if cardinals or prelates, for example, of their own free will or by surprise, should enter into part of our secrets, This is not at all an incentive for desiring their elevation to the see of Peter. That elevation would ruin us. Ambition alone would have led them to apostasy. The requirements of power would force them to sacrifice us. What we must ask for, what we should look for and wait for, as the Jews wait for the Messiah, is a pope according to our needs. With that we shall march more securely towards the assault on the church than with the pamphlets of our brethren in France and even the gold of England. Do you want to know the reason for this? It is that with this, in order to shatter the high rock on which God has built his church, we no longer need Hannibalian vinegar, or need gunpowder, or even need our arms. We have the little finger of the successor of Peter engaged in the ploy, and this little finger is as good for this crusade as in all the Urban IIs and all the St. Bernards in Christendom. We have no doubt that we will arrive at this supreme end of our efforts. But when? But how? The unknown is not yet revealed. Nevertheless, as nothing should turn us aside from the plan drawn up, and on the contrary, everything should tend to this, as early as tomorrow, success were going to crown the work that is barely sketched. We wish, in this instruction, which will remain secret for the mere initiates, to give the officials in the charge of the Supreme Vente, or Lodge, some advice that they should instill in all the brethren in the form of instruction or of memorandum. Close quote. I just want to stop there real quick. Note that how he said that these instructions are kept secret from the new initiates of Freemasonry. So when you become a Freemason, they don't immediately tell you, yeah, we're infiltrating the Catholic Church and we want to infuse our ideas into theirs, so they change their doctrines and practices. That's something you learn later. So they said that they're hiding these things from their new initiates. So let's continue. Continuing with the actual document of the Alta Vendita. Quote, now then, to assure ourselves a pope of the required dimensions, it is a question first of shaping for this pope a generation worthy of the reign we are dreaming of. Leave old people and those of mature age aside. Go to the youth, and if it is possible, even to the children. You will contrive for yourselves, at little cost, a reputation as good Catholics and pure patriots. This reputation will put all access to our doctrines in the midst of the young clergy. Let me repeat that. This reputation, of being good Catholics and pure patriots will put access to our doctrines in the midst of the young clergy, as well as deeply into the monasteries. We're talking about seminaries being infiltrated with the teaching. So they're raising up, or they have been raising up priests with Freemason ideas of theology. Yeah, that's very evident for anyone who's paying attention. So let's continue. Quote, in a few years, by the force of things, this young clergy will have overrun all the functions. They will form the sovereign's council. They will be called to choose a pontiff who should reign. And this pontiff, like most of his contemporaries, will be necessarily more or less imbued with the revolutionary Italian and humanitarian principles that we are going to begin to put into circulation. It is a small grain of black mustard that we are entrusting to the ground, but the sunshine of justice will develop it to the highest power, and you will see one day what a rich harvest this small seed will produce. Close quote. Just want to point out a couple of things here. They put emphasis on humanitarian principles, or what you might say, humanism. Now, humanism sounds like a good thing, and if it's properly subordinated into the rights of God, if it's rightly oriented towards God's desire and will for all men to be saved, then there's nothing wrong with that kind of humanism. But this kind of humanism is not that. This kind of humanism is putting man, the rights of man, above or equal to the rights of God. It's Luciferian, right? It's putting the rights and material needs of man above the submission to the authority of God. It's really all about authority. So instead of there being two great commandments, the first one being love the Lord thy God with all of your power, strength, and with all of your being, all your heart, mind, and strength. And the second one being love your neighbor as yourself. They put both of these great commandments, they merge them together as one. So being a humanist is equal to loving God in their eyes. That's what this is all about. So whenever, the rights of man, and you can see this in the French Revolution and to some extent in the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution, being inspired by, and the Declaration of Independence, inspired by John Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers. All right, let's continue with the document of the Alta Vendita. Quote, before we continue, sorry. And there also, this latest Pope, Francis, has also declared a new humanism too. So, just saying, his ideas coincide with these ideas. So perhaps they have their man sitting on this chair of St. Peter right now. Just a thought. Quote, in the path that we, the Freemasons, are laying out for our brethren, there are found great obstacles to conquer, difficulties of one kind to master. They will triumph over them by experience and by clear-sightedness, but the goal is so splendid that it is important to pull all the sails to the wind in order to reach it. You want to revolutionize Italy. Look for the Pope, whose portrait we have just drawn. You wish to establish the reign of the chosen ones on the throne of the prostitute of Babylon. Let the clergy march under your standard, always believing that they are marching under the banner of the apostolic keys. You intend to make the last vestige of tyrants and the oppressors disappear. Lay your snares, like Simon Bar-Jonah. Lay them in the sacristies, the seminaries, and the monasteries, rather than in the bottom of the sea. And if you do not hurry, we promise you a catch more miraculous than his. The fisher of fish became the fisher of men. You will bring friends around the apostolic chair. You will have preached a revolution in tiara and in cope, marching with the cross and with the banner, a revolution that will need to be only a little bit urged on to set fire to the four corners of the world. It now remains, close quote, it now remains for us to examine how successful this design has been. So they're saying explicitly that they're seeking to get into the high ranks of the church. And then it says that they want everyone to believe that the church is still Catholic. They want everyone to believe they're actually practicing Catholicism. But in reality, they're practicing the principles of the revolutionaries and the Freemasons. So this requires due diligence, prudence, and research. Living in the age of information that we live in today, there's no excuse for not having resources at your disposal. It's very, very easy to just get some basic principles of philosophy and theology from various sources, and you can see which ones are truly Catholic and authentically Catholic, and which ones are a hybrid of Catholicism and other religions, not to mention Freemasonry. So that is what we have on our plates today. So let us continue with the words of John Vennari. The Enlightenment, my friend, is blowing in the wind. Throughout the 19th century, society had become increasingly permeated with the liberal principles of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, to the great detriment of the Catholic faith and of the Catholic state. The supposedly kinder and gentler notions of religious pluralism, religious indifferentism, a democracy which believes all authority comes from the people, false notions of liberty, separation of church and state, interfaith gatherings, and other novelties were gripping the minds of post-Enlightenment Europe, infecting statesmen and churchmen alike. Close quote. So let's mention a couple of things here. So it should be noted that according to the Greek philosophers and several doctors of the Catholic Church, including St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Robert Bellarmine, among others, that democracy is the worst form of government alive because it denies nature, it denies the natural hierarchy that occurs, that one man should be fit to rule, serving the people in charity. One man is the supreme ruler and others are subordinate to him. So there's always someone who we have to answer to, and that's true in nature and that's true in the Catholic Church. That's why we have a pope and not a democracy. We're not Congregationalists where we could fire the pastor if we vote on it. So, and also separation of church and state was condemned by Pope Pius IX. We'll get to that in a future episode. And liberty, freedom of religion, also condemned by the First Commandment and the Catholic Church, so forth. Let's continue. John Vennari's words, quote, "The popes of the 19th century and early 20th century waged war against these dangerous trends in full battle dress, with clear-sighted presence of mind, rooted in an uncompromised certitude of faith. These popes were not taken in. They knew that evil principles, no matter how honorable they may appear, cannot bear good fruit. And these were evil principles at their worst, since they were rooted not only in heresy, but in apostasy." Close quote. Yes, if you read the popes of the 19th and early 20th century, they all went to war against revolutionary ideas of the world. Interestingly, the Vatican II Council, Pope John the 23rd, he wanted to open the windows of the church, get a breath of fresh air, and be more amiable to the world. He wanted to dialogue with the world. And they thought that that would produce a great new Pentecost that would have the revolutionaries pouring into the church. However sincere he might have been, he has utterly failed, and this dialogue with the world has actually resulted in not the world compromising and coming into the church, or converting to the church, rather. I mean, they have come into the church, but rather they're converting the church to the ideas of the world. The popes have not fought against the world in quite some time. Not in my lifetime, with maybe a few exceptions with Pope Benedict XVI, and not after the Vatican II Council. It's just been compromise after compromise, and the evidence is obvious if you dare to look. Let us continue with John Vennari's words. Quote, "Like commanding generals who recognize the duty to hold their ground at all costs, these popes, the earlier popes, aimed powerful cannons at the errors of the modern world and fired incessantly. The encyclicals were their cannonballs, and they never missed their target. The most devastating blast came in the form of Pope Pius IX's monumental 1864 Syllabus of Errors, and when the smoke cleared, all involved in the battle were in no doubt as to who was on what side. The lines of demarcation had clearly been drawn. In this great syllabus, Pius IX condemned the principal errors of the modern world, not because they were modern, but because these new ideas were rooted in pantheistic naturalism, and were therefore incompatible with Catholic doctrine, as well as being destructive to society. The teachings in the syllabus were counter-liberalism, and the principles of liberalism were counter-syllabus. This was unquestionably recognized by all parties. Father Dennis Fahey referred to this showdown as Pius IX versus the pantheistic deification of man. Speaking for the other side, the French Freemason Ferdinand Buisson likewise declared, "A school cannot remain neutral between the syllabus and the Declaration of the Rights of Man." Next section, liberal Catholics. Quote, "Yet the 19th century saw a new breed of Catholic who utopianly sought a compromise between the two. These men looked for what they believed to be good in the principles of 1789 and tried to introduce them into the church. Many clergymen, infected by the spirit of the age, were caught into this net and have been cast into the sacristies and into the seminaries. They came to be known as liberal Catholics. Pope Pius IX remarked that they, the liberal Catholics, were the worst enemies of the church. Despite this, their numbers increased. Close quote. Next section heading, Pope St. Pius X and Modernism. Quote, this crisis peaked around the beginning of the 20th century when the liberalism of 1789 that had been blowing in the wind swirled into the tornado of modernism. Father Vincent Micheli identified this heresy as such by describing modernism's trinity of parents. He wrote, 1. Its religious ancestor is the Protestant Reformation. 2. Its philosophical parent is the Enlightenment. 3. Its political pedigree comes from the French Revolution. Close quote. Okay, so why the Protestant Reformation? The classical Protestants, a few of them which still remain today, which are normally pretty conservative and also combatant against liberalism normally, it's the idea that one can interpret scripture for oneself, under the guise that the Holy Spirit is guiding my reading and interpretation. That opened the door to all kinds of heresies and all kinds of ideas. So in Germany, you had Luther's revolt, and then after that, you had German higher criticism, a naturalistic reading of the Bible, questioning the doctrines of the Bible and the miracles, the supernatural faith, and they naturalized everything and explained all the miracles away, and they explained away the supernatural revelation of the Bible. So instead of it coming from above, revealed by God, the Bible is nothing but a collection of religious ideas that came from man. I mean, that would have never, these ideas would have never come forth, especially from Germany, if the Protestant Revolution had ever taken place. And liberalism and enlightenment would have never happened if the Protestant ideas did not spread throughout all of Europe. So although Martin Luther probably never intended these things to happen, nevertheless, they are an inevitable result of I get to interpret the Bible for myself. So the Enlightenment is its philosophical foundation of Freemasonry, and the French Revolution was its pride parade. And then, in my opinion, and the opinion of many likewise minded people, the Vatican II Council was their pride parade in the Catholic Church. Let us continue. Words of John Vennari. Quote, Pope St. Pius X, who ascended to the papal chair in 1903, recognized modernism as a most deadly plague that must be arrested. He wrote that the most important obligation of the Pope is to ensure the purity and integrity of Catholic doctrine, and he further stated that if he did nothing, then he would have had failed in his essential duty. St. Pius X waged a war on modernism, issued an encyclical called Pascendi Gregis, and a syllabus, Lamentabili, against it, and instituted the anti-modernist oath to be sworn by all priests and theology teachers, purged the seminaries and universities of modernists, and excommunicated the stubborn and the unrepentant. Close quote. Interesting that Pope Pius X, St. Pius X, he instituted the oath against modernism. So in order to teach in the seminaries, you had to swear the oath of modernism. And in order to become a priest, you had to swear an oath against modernism. So why then did Pope Paul VI, why did he get rid of the oath against modernism? He either thought that modernism wasn't a problem in the church, which is ridiculous if you look at the evidence, or he himself was a modernist, which is highly likely. Let us continue. John Vennari's words, quote, St. Pius X effectively halted the spread of modernism in his day. It is reported, however, that when he was congratulated for having eradicated this grave error, St. Pius X immediately responded that despite all his efforts, he had not succeeded in killing the beast, but had only driven it underground. He warned that if church leaders were not vigilant, it would return in the future more virulent than ever. Close quote. Next section heading, Curia on the alert. Quote, a little-known drama that unfolded during the reign of Pope Pius XI demonstrates that the underground current of modernist thought was alive and well in the immediate post-Pius X period. Father Raymond Duloc relates that at the Secret Consistory of May 23, 1923, Pope Pius XI questioned the 30 cardinals of the Curia on the timeliness of summoning an ecumenical council. In attendance were such illustrious prelates as Cardinal Mary del Val, Delay, Gaspari, Boggiani, and Villot. The cardinals advised against an ecumenical council. Cardinal Villot warned, the existence of profound differences in the midst of the episcopacy itself cannot be concealed. They run the risk of giving place to discussions that will be prolonged indefinitely. Boggiani recalled the modernist theories from which, he said, a part of the clergy and of the bishops were not exempt. The mentality can incline certain fathers to present motions to introduce methods incompatible with Catholic traditions. Villot was even more precise. He expressed his fear of seeing the council, this alleged new council that was going to be taking place, maneuvered by the worst enemies of the church, the modernists, who were already getting ready, as certain indications show, to bring forth the revolution in the church, a new 1789. In discouraging the idea of a council for such reasons, these cardinals showed themselves more apt to recognizing the signs of the times than all the post-Vatican II theologians combined. Yet their caution may have been rooted in something deeper. They may also have been haunted by the writings of the infamous Illumine, the excommunicated Canon Roca, who lived from 1830 to 1893, who preached revolution and church reform, and who predicted a subversion of the church that would be brought about by a council. Close quote. So in 1923, Pope Pius XI, he proposed an ecumenical council to deal with the modernist heresies. All of his most trusted cardinals advised against it because they were afraid that the modernists in the church would manipulate and take over the council and very subtly begin to change the church from within to look more like the Freemasonic Lodge. Interesting that 40 years later there was a council, and that's exactly what happened. So it was, the writing was on the wall. They knew that these modernist heretics, taking the ideas of Freemasonry, they knew that they were in the church in high places, and they didn't want them to have a council because they knew what would happen. Let us continue. Next section heading, Canon Roca's Revolutionary Ravings. Quote, in his book, Athanasius and the Church of Our Time, Bishop Graber refers to the Canon Roca's prediction of a new enlightened church, which would be influenced by the socialism of Jesus and the apostles. In the mid-19th century, Roca had predicted, the new church, which might not be able to retain anything of scholastic doctrine, and the original form of the former church, will nevertheless receive consecration and canonical jurisdiction from Rome. Bishop Graber, commenting on this prediction, remarked, a few years ago, this was still inconceivable to us, but today, Canon Roca also predicted a liturgical reform. New Mass of Paul VI. With reference to the future liturgy, he believed that the divine cult, in the form directed by the liturgy, ceremonial, ritual regulations of the Roman Church, will shortly undergo a transformation at an ecumenical council, which will restore to it the venerable simplicity of the golden age of the apostles in accordance with the dictates of conscience and modern civilization. He foretold that through this council will come a perfect accord between the ideals of modern civilization and the ideal of Christ and his gospel. This will be the consecration of the new social order and the solemn baptism of modern civilization. Roca also spoke of the future of the papacy. He wrote, there is a sacrifice in the offing which represents a solemn act of expiation. The papacy will fall. It will die under the hallowed knife which the fathers of the last council will forge. The papal Caesar is a host, or a victim, crowned for the sacrifice. Roca enthusiastically predicted a new religion, new dogma, new ritual, new priesthood. He called the new priest progressists, or we could say progressives. He speaks of the suppression of the soutane cassock and the marriage of priests. Chilling echoes of Rocca and the Alta Vendita are to be found in the words of the Rosicrucian Dr. Rudolf Steiner, who declared in 1910, "We need a council and a pope to proclaim it." Close quote. So let's go back to just a few lines ago. He mentions the suppression of the cassock. Interestingly, only a few months ago, Pope Francis, he ridiculed priests who still wear the cassock and the saturno, even saying that they were kind of like Pharisees and that they had psychological and even moral problems. So it appears that Pope Francis is fulfilling what Canon Rocca, the revolutionary, predicted. Interesting. Let us continue. Next section heading, The Great Council That Never Was. Quote, around 1948, Pope Pius XII, at the request of the staunchly orthodox Cardinal Ruffini, considered calling a general council and even spent a few years making the necessary preparations. There is evidence that progressive elements in Rome eventually dissuaded Pope Pius XII from bringing it to realization, since this council showed definite signs of being in sync with Humani Generis. Like this great 1950 encyclical, the new council would combat false opinions, which threatened to undermine the foundations of Catholic doctrine. Tragically, Pope Pius XII became convinced that he was too advanced in years to shoulder this momentous task, and he resigned himself to the idea that this will be for my successor to do. Close quote. Next section heading, Roncalli to consecrate ecumenism. Quote, throughout the pontificate of Pope Pius XII, which was from 1939 to 1958, the Holy Office, under the able leadership of Cardinal Ottaviani, maintained a safe Catholic landscape by keeping the wild horses of modernism firmly corralled. Many of today's modernist theologians disdainfully recount how they and their friends had been muzzled during this period. Yet even Ottaviani could not prevent what was to happen in 1958. A new type of pope, whom the progressive believed to favor their cause, would ascend to the pontifical chair and would force a reluctant Ottaviani to remove the latch, open the corral, and brace himself for the stampede. However, such a state of affairs was not unforeseen. At the news of the death of Pius XII, the old Dom Lambert Baudin, a friend of Cardinal Roncalli, the future Pope John XXIII, confided to Father Louis Boyer, if they elect Roncalli, everything would be saved. He would be capable of calling a council and consecrating ecumenism. And so it happened. Cardinal Roncalli was elected and called a council which consecrated ecumenism. The revolution in tiara and cope was underway. Close quote. So I'm going to end there. We'll get a part 2 on the Alta Vendita and some of its ideas. So you have everything kind of laid out. Much of what is written here in this little pamphlet has been fulfilled and is still being fulfilled in our lifetime. So yes, there is documented and objective evidence that the Masons, the Freemasons, intended to infiltrate the Catholic Church, and the evidence is in. They have been successful. But will they prevail in the end? No, they will not, because Christ promised that the gates of hell, i.e. false doctrine, will not prevail against the church. He doesn't promise that the church will never be infiltrated and go through trials and be even in many places in the world appear to have fallen. But he does say in the end his Sacred Heart will triumph. The church will not fall. There will always be a faithful remnant to carry on the teaching of Christ and the apostles. And in the end, he will conquer and triumph. So we must pray for that. We must pray for the renewal of the church. Pray that the New World Order will be defeated and the Old World Order will be restored. And that's what we're all about here. So yes, I have the tinfoil hat, and yes, the conspiracies are true and actual, and the evidence clearly shows that it is. So I will remove now my tinfoil hat, because it is not crazy talk, it is reality. So God bless you. In nomine Patris, et Filii, Spiritus Sancti.